Start recording. Screen share. Okay. So our short story was Two Kinds by Amy Tan. Um, it's one of the essay short stories in the Joy Luck Club.
The first lens is the biographical lens. Just some background on the author. Amy Tan was born to Chinese immigrants in Northern California in 1952 and grew up as a Californian girl choosing American things over Chinese, despite her family being from China. She didn't feel Chinese, she felt American, although they did live overseas for some time. She and her mother had significant strife as she was growing up due to general mother-daughter conflict as well as disappointment of expectations. And much of this conflict in the story comes from the culture clash between she and her mother. In 1987, her mother fell ill and recovered, and they traveled to China to see the family she had left behind. The trip provided perspective on their difficult relationship and helped heal the strife. And Two Kinds is part of a book called The Joy Luck Club that details many of the same events Tan lived or heard about. So, Amy Tan as the narrator. Much of the events described in Two Kinds are very similar to those in the real life of author Amy Tan. She says, my mother had traded house cleaning services for weekly lessons and a piano for me to practice on every day, 2 hours a day, from 4 until 6. An article from the New York Times says, Tan said about her own mother, Miss Tan expected her to be a neurosurgeon and a concert pianist in her spare time. Both Tan's mother and the narrator's mother expected their children to become prodigies, while they wanted nothing more to be normal children. Each daughter fails to understand the mother's need to see American successes coupled with Chinese wisdom and secrets. At the time of their youth, both Amy Tan and the narrator were unable to see why their mothers would push them so hard to become a prodigy or acquire fame. The mothers had felt so much loss in China, and this was a way for them to keep their Chinese heritage alive. Both Amy Tan and the narrator grew up in California. This means they would have grown up seeing many of the same things and living much of the same life. Tan grew up as an American, not as a Chinese immigrant like her mother. This is the same case for the narrator. She writes, she was proudly modest like a proper Chinese child. The narrator would have no notion or want of what being a stereotypical proper Chinese child was like. This would only come from what her mother would tell her she needed to be like. So for the time, the story is set in the 1950s or 60s, years after the narrator's mother had come to America in 1949. Amy Tan's mother also immigrated from China to the US in 1949. She writes, she had come here in 1949 after losing everything in China. Her mother and father, her family home, for her first husband and 2 daughters, twin baby girls. The narrator's mother dealt with so much hardship while living in China because of the war. This leads her to wanting success for her child and therefore pushing her to become a prodigy. While having good intentions, this pursuit of greatness only led to a rift between the two. Discussion questions. How did growing up in California rather than somewhere else in America affect the events in the story? And for the second one, how would the story be different if it was set in today's time rather than in the mid-1900s?
So the next lens is the psychological lens. Amy Tan, author, was the daughter of a Chinese immigrant, as Landon said, and in Two Kinds, Jing Mei is the main character and also the daughter of a Chinese immigrant. And Jing Mei's mother believes that in America, anything is possible. So this belief pushed Jing Mei to become a prodigy. And Amy felt similar pressure from her own mother. Jing Mei's response to this pressure included self-esteem issues and eventually displacement, all of which she details in Two Kinds. A stereotype that you may be familiar with is that of the immigrant parent and their prodigy child. Chinese parents, according to the Midwest Quarterly, have closer bonds with their children when in China, because the geographical landmarks in China are essential to the understanding of the lessons taught to the children. So this article was an academic article which was based on Amy Tan's relationship with her mother specifically, and also immigrant parents and their children in general. And Wood suggests that a shared home country allows for the child to have a better understanding of the parents and their own identity. Because Jingmei was struggling with her Chinese mother's ideals in a Western world, there was a discord, and this led to resentment and displacement between the two of them. Every night after dinner, my mother and I would sit at the Formica kitchen table, and she would present new tests. So Jingmei's mother wanted nothing but success for her daughter, but soon Jingmei hated the tests, the raised hopes, and failed expectations. Failing repeatedly brought self-esteem issues to Jingmei, and she dealt with this through displacement, which is when you satisfy an impulse through a substitute object. And according to the same study from the Midwest Quarterly, the lack of a cultural bond between immigrants and their children informs the tension of the mother-daughter relationships in the United States and creates a generational gap that the mothers neither anticipate nor understand. The test and her failure, as I said, lowered Jingmei's self-esteem, which led to her use of displacement as a defense mechanism. And her mother didn't understand this reaction because she came from a different cultural background. Jingmei's mother soon decided that piano would be Jingmei's new skill, and Jingmei felt as though she had been sent to hell when her mother brought up this new idea. So Jingmei resented her mother's prodigy ideals and used displacement to handle it. Initially, instead of confronting her mother about it, who would not hear her argument, Jingmei purposefully avoided becoming a good piano player. She was so determined not to try, not to be anybody different, that she learned to play only the most ear-splitting preludes, the most discordant hymns. Jingmei used her frustration with her mother to drive her intentional failure at the piano. So that's how she was displacing her frustration with her mom, by instead trying to become bad at the piano or just not focusing on honing her skills. So in summary, Jingmei and her mother don't see eye to eye because they were born in different cultures, and her mother had really high expectations for her daughter. And Jingmei, after failing to become a prodigy, develops inner turmoil and handles it through displacement. Rather than dealing with her emotions, Jingmei rebels against her mother and she refused to learn the piano correctly. So the psychological interpretive questions. Firstly, what was the root of Amy's determination to fail? Why wouldn't she want to become a prodigy anymore when previously she had been even more excited? Oh, also Jingmei, my apologies. She had been even more excited about it than her mother had. And then how did Jingmei project her inability to become a prodigy on her mother? And projection is when somebody attributes their own issues to another person.
So I have the archetypal lens. First, we can categorize Jingmei as the innocent. The innocent is overly optimistic, and they only see the good in everything. They enjoy the simple things and are pure at heart. The innocent is usually represented by a child. Jingmei fits into this mold in the beginning of the story when she's still holding out hope of being a child prodigy. She was just as excited as her mother, maybe even more so. She sees her mother's tests and high hopes and expectations as exciting. She pictured this prodigy part of herself as many different images. She sees potential in herself. She still believes that she has a special talent hidden away that will make her famous. She only sees the good in her mother and these expectations, until Jingmei hits a breaking point during her mother's tests. After seeing her mother's disappointed face once again, something inside of her began to die. Now she saw her mother's optimism and high expectations as harmful and an inconvenience to her. Jingmei starts to rebel against her mother and these expectations. This is when she starts to fit the rebel archetype, more specifically, the troublemaker. Troublemakers enjoy disrupting the status quo and provoking others. They also welcome the change that comes from the chaos and agitation they leave in their wake. She refused to let her mother change her, and she was determined not to try. She refused her mother's expectations and ignored the power her mother had over her. This disrupts the status quo. She believed she didn't have to do what her mother said anymore. She believed she wasn't her slave. She continues to try to break down her mother's power over her. She could sense her mother's anger rising to a breaking point and wanted to see it spill over. She wants her mother to explode with anger. She provokes her mother and wants to see the change and freedom that she will earn from it. She doesn't want to be pushed to find a talent anymore. Jingmei can also be seen as an anti-hero. An anti-hero is a main character without any heroic qualities. They don't have exceptional idealism, courage, or morality. Anti-heroes are flawed and have some less than noble qualities. Jingmei isn't a genius. She lacks the superpowers and uniqueness that you often see in main characters and heroes. She's also lacking in morals. She notes that old Chang's eyes were too slow to keep up with the wrong notes she was playing. She not only makes fun of Mr. Chang's older appearance with a nickname, she also takes advantage of his weaknesses. She uses his decaying eyesight and deafness against him so that she can get away with being lazy in these piano lessons. This shows she is lacking a strong moral compass. She also notes that she learned that during her piano lessons, she could be lazy and get away with mistakes. This shows that Jingmei isn't particularly hardworking either. So Jingmei starts as an innocent, then becomes the troublemaker, and she is an anti-hero throughout. Jingmei's mother can be seen as a ruler. Rulers want to prevent chaos by taking control. They need security and order, and strive to gain and retain power. The mother was determined to make Jingmei into a child prodigy. She forced her into all manner of different tests to find out what she was good at. She forced Jingmei to take piano lessons. She did all of this regardless of how Jingmei felt about it. Even after Jingmei's failure at the talent show, her mother tried to keep the power by forcing her to keep going to piano lessons. When Jingmei rebelled and tried to take power, her mother shouted at her. She said, "There are only two kinds of daughters, those who are obedient and those who follow their own mind. And only the obedient daughter can live in this house." She did this in an attempt to take back some of the power and retain the power she had left. Lastly, Mr. Chang can be seen as an absent-minded professor. The absent-minded professor is talented and brilliant, but has a flaw that interferes with this brilliance. They can be unorganized, forgetful, or lacking in social competence. Mr. Chang was very strange, always tapping his fingers to the silent music of an invisible orchestra. He very much lives within his head. His talent was music, more specifically piano. However, he was deaf. So this interfered with his ability to teach piano to Jingmei, as did his poor eyesight, as his eyes were too slow to keep up with the wrong notes that Jingmei was playing. So my discussion questions are, how do all of the archetypes that fit to Jingmei affect the story? And in what ways does the story fit into the hero's journey? How does the story break out from the hero's journey? And what effects does this have on the understanding of the story and its theme?
So my lens was the post-colonial lens. So there are two different ways that you could go with this, where Jingmei is the colonized and her mother is the colonizer. Oops. And the second way is that Jingmei and her family and her community are the colonized and the Americans are the colonizers, even though they live in America. The second one is historically correct, but the first one is more like applicable to the story, so I'm going to focus on the first one. So the lens, the post-colonial lens, asks, how does the story comment on, represent, or repress the marginalized voices? And that's from the page in the textbook with the lenses. So in post-colonialism, there are the colonizers who do the colonizing, and then there's the other, who is the marginalized and oppressed by the colonizers. Through this lens, Jingmei is the colonized or